Copenhagen, and welcome to the world premiere of this talk entitled Dream Machines and Walled Gardens. It's a clicker that doesn't work. There we go. It's a story that starts out in Chicago in 1937, when Ted Nelson was born, child of two big Hollywood names. His father, Ralph Nelson, and his mother, Celeste Holm, who was a luminous actress who would soon win an Academy Award for her role in A Gentleman's Agreement. She lit up Broadway in Oklahoma and became one of Hollywood's most versatile leading ladies. The father, Ralph Nelson, was a director with a reputation for grit and vision. He was later known for films like Lilies of the Field, which won Sidney Poitier his very first Academy Award. And on paper, this sounds like a fairy tale beginning, the golden boy of Hollywood royalty. But reality was far from glamorous. His parents' marriage collapsed just as soon as it began, and they pursued their demanding careers. And sadly, their son, Ted, became a complication in their lives that were already spinning too fast. So instead of the glitter of Los Angeles, he was sent east to be raised by his maternal grandparents. This was for practical and emotional reasons, and custody was transferred to Celeste Holm's parents, Edith and Ted Holm Sr., and they formally adopted young Ted, making him their legal son rather than their grandson. This arrangement gave him security, a home, stability, and a family name that would protect him from the glitz of Hollywood, but also meant that in a strange way he was doubly displaced, legally redefined, set apart from his birth parents, and raised in a world that wasn't quite his own. Because Ted's grandparents were not Hollywood stars, but intellectuals, and they lived in a home steeped with books, conversation, and ideas. Edith had been a writer, and the family life revolved very much about literature. They had shelves of novels, plays, essays that surrounded the boy. And, sorry about that, the reading wasn't only encouraged, it was something that was expected. And growing up in that environment gave him a very different stage than what his parents had in Hollywood. It was a world of stories, and imagination mattered above everything else. And in his early years, Ted Nelson lived inside text. No one could have guessed it at that time, but surrounded by books and immersed in text, he would soon sort of ideas, the first seeds of an idea that all texts are connected, and that someday he might build a system to show it. So alongside the books that his grandparents were reading, young Ted grew a passion for science fiction. And he devoured pulp magazines, stories that stretched imagination beyond every day. Among his favorites were L. Ron Hubbard. This was way before he freaked out on the Scientology thing. And in particular, books like Old Doc Methuselah, which is about a wandering physician who travels across the universe healing people. And it wasn't the spectacle of spaceships and ray guns that struck it with Ted. It was the sense of infinite possibility, that knowledge and story could leap across worlds. Another one, also from Hubbard, Typewriter in the Sky, was one of his big favorites. It's about a pianist who is written into his friend's novel and lives out a swashbuckling adventure that is not of his own choosing. And whenever the author types on his typewriter, he will hear the clanking sounds of the typewriter in the sky, and he's left to wonder wherever he can ever escape this story. The big change was when Ted Nelson, as a teenager, read The Voyage of the Space Beagle. It's a novel about a starship crewed with experts in all different areas of science. and they encounter terrifying alien threats on their journey throughout the universe. And the specialists are constantly at odds with each other, each one trapped in their own little narrow field. And the hero who saves them all is a nexalist. Not a specialist, but someone who's trained to weave together knowledge from all different fields. This idea electrified Ted. Here was a word for the thing he was destined to be. Not a narrow expert, but a synthesist. Someone who could stand at the intersection and connections of all fields that normally didn't speak to each other. And he began calling himself an nexalist, a badge of honor for him. He even drew up his own business card, Theodore H. Nelson, nexalist. And this wasn't a joke to him. It was a declaration. He wouldn't be boxed in as a programmer, a writer, or a filmmaker. He would be someone who crossed those boundaries and refused to choose just one discipline. So this was sort of a statement of intent, a mission for his life in pocket form. So at his grandparents' dinner table, they would have magazines like Life magazine always lying around, and they would discuss the things that were written in there, read aloud for each other, just as they would discuss everyday events. And one evening, young Ted picked up the September 10, 1945 issue of this magazine and came across an extraordinary article, Vannevar Bush's As We May Think. Now, Vannevar Bush was a towering figure in the wartime scientific establishment. He was President Roosevelt's advisor and the man who had overseen America's vast research efforts during the war. In this essay, however, he does not look back at the war that just has ended. He's looking forward to peace. And he wrote about the accelerating flood of information in modern life and the need for new ways to think, new ways to connect, new ways to manage knowledge. His vision was not just of science, but also of invention as a partner for human thought and creativity. This was an unforgettable encounter for young Ted Nelson. This marvelous magazine article about knowledge in the future and the tools that we would have to explore them. And in particular, this little machine known as the Memex. Vannevar Bush describes this machine, the Memex, which looks like an ordinary desk, but it's something hidden inside. A personal archive of knowledge. Using microfilm, a person would store books, records, their personal notes, and articles. But the innovation here wasn't storage. With the keyboard and levers on this machine, the user could control associative trails between the different parts of information. And the Memex would remember these paths. And this machine wasn't built, but the idea saw seeds in not only Ted Nelson's mind, but with loads of people. Sometime during his childhood years, young Ted walked past a florist, which had a sign outside of it that read, "Flowers by wire." And that was the slogan for the Florist Telegraph Delivery, which was a network created by florists in the United States where you could go into a branch in New York and buy flowers, and they would telegram a branch in, for example, Los Angeles, and deliver them from there, virtually erasing geographical distances. However, young Ted Nelson didn't read this as marketing. He took it literally. And he stood there imagining how a rose could be split up into parts, sent through a wire, and reassembled somewhere else. And he spent loads of time thinking about this. And his thoughts were that we would need to pick the flower apart as you would do with the daisy. bit by bit and have some sort of mechanism where you could feed the parts of the flower into. And he was thinking things that most children do not. Thinking about how could we use radio waves to transmit this thing and have it materialize at the other end. Odd thoughts for a 10-year, 12-year-old kid to think. But this is what Ted Nelson was like. Years later, he started studying at Swarthmore College, just outside Philadelphia. But he did not pursue science, or the classics. He gravitated towards arts, film and writing. Whatever sparked his restless imagination. He made short films, experimented with theater, tried his hand at just about every sort of storytelling. And this was a time where computers were still remote, hidden away in laboratories as institutional machines, and Nelson was chasing ideas about narrative, expression, and creativity. He wasn't yet a technologist. He was a budding filmmaker and a writer searching for new ways to capture experiences. But even if Swarthmore didn't make him a technologist, it gave him a technological or a creative lens to look at the world through. After a long struggle, he managed to get into Harvard, and there he was introduced to computers for the first time. And that really sparked his mind. There we go. And even though he wasn't trained as a computer scientist, his encounter with computers made him starting to sketch out ideas that belong in the computer science realm. He was playing around with notions of information structures, text systems, and new ways of representing knowledge. And he approached the computers not as an engineer, but as an outsider who wanted to do more and wanted to close the gap between discipline and imagination. It was a revolution waiting to begin.
The research program that I'm going to describe to you is quickly characterizable by saying, if in your office you as an intellectual worker were supplied with a computer display backed up by a computer that was alive for you all day and was instantly responsive, instantly responsive to every action you had, how much value could you derive from that? Well, this basically characterizes what we've been pursuing for many years in what we call the Augmented Human Intellect Research Center at Stanford Research Institute.
So, in December 1968, an engineer called Douglas Engelbart took the stage at a conference, and for 90 minutes, the audience watched in stunned silence as he demonstrated things no one had seen before. On a giant screen behind him, Engelbart clicked a small wooden device he called a mouse, and text appeared in windows. He edited documents live, navigated hypertext, even collaborated with a colleague who was at a different geographical location on screen, miles away. This single event would later be known as the mother of all demos. And in one performance, Engelbart revealed tools that would define modern computing: the mouse, word processing, video conferencing, real-time collaboration, hyperlinks, whatnot. It showed tools for thought, creativity, and connection. But Ted Nelson, to him, this was not news. Before Engelbart's famous demonstration, he had already seen this work at Xerox PARC and Stanford and other places, and he had visited with Engelbart while he was working on this. And he found this interesting, but at the same time, he was a bit disappointed because he thought that these people had missed the point. Ted Nelson was not looking for machines that recreated what we already had with typewriters and paper. He was interested in changing the way we processed information. What excited him was the idea of reshaping culture itself, how writing, scholarship, ideas could live on in new forms. So he didn't feel astonished. He felt frustration because he saw someone building practical tools for business while he was dreaming of a new form of literature. So in the mother of all demos, Engelbart works with a very, very famous text, the Declaration of Independence. And on screen, the phrase, "all men are created equal," was edited using the mouse and the cursor. Words were added, removed, and rearranged, and in 1968, this was indeed astonishing. Text editing at that time was not what you see is what you get. It was more like a programming experience where you would use commands to change the individual lines, so edit line 5 to this, delete that line, and so forth. So even if we saw text come alive on screen, Nelson's ideas of how to edit text was entirely different. Now, with his literary background, he was very much inspired by the author William Burroughs, and in particular the book The Soft Machine. William Burroughs had a very experimental style of writing. We can imagine that his first draft for a part of The Soft Machine read something like this. But what William Burroughs would do was that he would cut up his manuscript and also add things like newspaper clippings that he would cut up word by word, and then just go ahead and rearrange them into new texts. So writing new text through transformation of existing things. And this really inspired Ted Nelson's thoughts about what text editing really should be and how what the process should look like. So at Harvard, he began trying to build and put his ideas into practice, creating what was known as the JOT text editor. JOT is short for juggler of text. So he had the idea that you would take bits and pieces of text, juggle them around, and change text through that. This was his first real software project. He was not really a programmer himself, so he had to have the computer engineers at Harvard write this as he came up with the specification for this. This was a small baby step towards his final vision, but it gave him a taste of what it meant to bend the machine towards writing and ideas instead of computers being something used to crunch numbers. And he realized that text could be transformed by computers. The editing process looked very much like what we had seen at Mother of All demos. You could edit text. The real genius thing here was not how the actual user experience of editing things was. It was all about how this was stored. Because it was not only a text editor, it was also an idea of data structures. So everything was broken down into its elements and stored onto tape. Just like William Burroughs cut up his manuscript into single words, you would store words as a sequence on the tape, and whenever you edited the text, you would not change what was stored before. You would instead store new changes, so you had a continuous stretch of tape with all of the history going back. This was 1962, and today we see similar ideas like this in blockchain or Git, like things are stored there. And this became a fundamental building block of his work that was to come later. In 1965, at the ACM conference in Cleveland, Nelson presented a paper with a very unusual title. It was called A File Structure for the Complex, Changing, and Indeterminate. It was a paper that coined the word hypertext. So this is the first time ever that the expression hypertext is used. He described this as something called non-sequential writing, text that branches, that links between other things, and that gives the reader the opportunity to choose his own path. In this paper, he references Vannevar Bush's Memex that had inspired him when he was around 8 years old. So we can see the idea and inspiration he got as a kid having tremendous influence on Ted Nelson through the years, the hypertext. So while working on the Jot text editor, loads of things were happening in the computer world, which is the term that Ted Nelson always uses for talking about the IT business and academies and universities and everyone doing computer science. And he was frustrated by the amount of gatekeeping that was there. He called this the computer priesthood. And this was the foundation for a milestone publication. The priesthood to him were the insiders who were the programmers and operators of computers who understood and knew the arcane rituals of compilers, punch cards, command syntax, and to everyone else outside of their world, computers were intimidating, mysterious, and even, in a sense, forbidden. The priesthood's power lay in making the machines seem too complex for outsiders to even approach. And we can imagine this looking something like, I'm just going to throw this away and use the keyboard instead, like this. You had this priesthood guarding the big mainframe computer, and you cannot touch this because only they can interpret this code. You would not understand it because of the requests violating the protocols and resource allocation, everything sort of in a lingo that the layman would not understand. As Nelson said, they spatter you with unintelligible answers. And people were asking the questions, how can I learn this if I'm not allowed to try? And this is where Ted Nelson runs onto the scene with his milestone publication, Computer Lib, with the slogan, "You can and must understand computers now." This was a publication he wrote and published himself in 1974. And what he wanted to do with this book was to call out the priesthood. It's part manifesto, a part a handbook to what computers are and how they work. And it's a declaration saying that computers are too important to be only available to the specialist and expert. And with cartoons, slogans, plain language explanations, Nelson told the readers exactly the thing that it says on the cover. You can and you must understand computers now. It was a call to arms. It was an invitation to everyone to take part in the computer revolution. And he told the stories about what he called the deep, dark secret. And the secret was simple. It's only that computers aren't really magical. They're just machines following instructions. And those instructions can be explained clearly to everyone. And through the illustrations and texts he wrote in this book, he explained exactly this to people, that you can be part of this. And it's not a underground cult. computers are meant to be for everyone, and it's meant to be part of everyday life and take on any form and be around you in all sorts of ways. Because for Ted Nelson, knowledge was empowerment, and by revealing the deep, dark secret, he was handing the ordinary people the keys to the machine. But this book was not only the manifesto that Computer Lib is. You could pick the book up, flip it over, and on the back end, a second book was bound back to back with the other one. And Nelson called that side Dream Machines. That's the title of this talk. Dream Machines was a visionary exploration of what these machines might become. It was less about how computers worked and more about what they could do. And Ted Nelson imagined computers as engines for creativity, learning and play. He pictured interactive movies where the audiences could choose their own storyline. He described teaching machines that would adapt to every single student, turning education into a way of exploring things rather than rote memorization. And he speculated about new forms of art that would only exist on screen, combining sound, text, and images in no ways a book or a film could ever do. Let's go back in time to 1816, where Samuel Taylor Coleridge published a poem called The Kubla Khan. It's a visionary fragment about an imaginary palace. And the poem opens with a few very famous lines. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree. And Coleridge described a dreamlike world of domes, caverns, winding rivers, places that were both mysterious and magnificent. And for Nelson, the word Xanadu captured exactly what he wanted his system to be. A palace of knowledge where texts, ideas, and media could flow together in rich, unexpected ways. And since this being the early 70s, computers weren't available in every home around the world, so he imagined Xanadu cafes, much like the McDonald's franchise, where you could have these scattered in towns across the country, across the continents, and across the entire world, where you could walk in, sit down at the terminal, and instantly be part of a vast, interconnected system of knowledge. These weren't meant to be hushed laboratories like the computer priesthood had. These were meant to be social spaces, inclusive to everyone, where you could have buzzing conversations, collaboration, and play all around computers, where you could read and explore, but also create and contribute and help build this ever-expanding, vast knowledge of modern, futuristic literature that would be found online. So Nelson's vision of a docuverse would be alive and constantly expanding, not private tools for specialists, but something that was there for everyone. This was a connected world, not just a technical system, but also a philosophy. Nelson believed that knowledge was interwoven and that no idea stood alone. He argued that computers should reflect that truth instead of forcing information into rigid hierarchies. And this was long before the web. Nelson imagined a network where reading and writing would be part of the same act. It was never about the machines themselves. It was always about liberating human imagination and giving people the ability and tools to explore information freely. What others saw as engineering, he framed as a literary revolution. And in 1981, he published the first of many volumes of literary machines. And this was more the specification for his Xanadu hypertext system. The first one, the first edition, was written by himself. He produced everything himself, more or less, ever. It was written on a typewriter and copied on a Saxon copy machine that filled his house with a very vinegary smell. I'm not sure if any one of you are old enough to remember those hand-cranked copiers that were blue in color. Yeah, quite a few people. So one of those. But it had a very beautiful silk screen cover. It looked like this. I drew this from the 1987 edition, which is the one I have. But it wasn't just philosophy at this point. It laid out a concept that pushed Xanadu closer to implementation. And starting with his experimentation or thoughts about how flowers could be transferred across the wire, he had always been thinking about how information could be stored and addressed. He did this with his JOT editor, experimented with recording changes as a stream of operation and changes to the tape. And in literary machines, this matured into something he called tumblers, which were a precise addressing scheme where every single piece of information could be located and addressed individually. The book itself follows his ideas and thoughts. It's very non-linear in design. It's designed to be read jumping back and forth like hyperlinks on paper. So hyperlinks, the way we know them on the web, they are one-way links where one document points to another. In Nelson's design, it's a very different concept. You have bidirectional links. So every single fragment has a link going both ways, and this has some powerful effects. Links cannot break. Even if a document is moved or changed, the address will still remain valid. And web references will be visible from both sides and carry a trail back to the source. This is similar to what Google would do a decade later with their PageRank algorithm, but they built their search empire on crawling the web and finding these links, whereas in Nelson's Xanadu system, they would already be built in and visible to everyone using and reading and consuming information. Perhaps the most famous of his ideas from this is something called transclusion. It's also a word that Ted Nelson coined. And it's his way of reusing and quoting information. In today's world, when we copy and paste, we create duplicates. And the original gets disconnected. The copy can drift and change and be misattributed. Nelson thought this was wrong. A quotation shouldn't be a copy at all. It should be a living reference back to the original, permanently connecting to its source. And transclusion meant that every time knowledge is reused, you would build an ever-growing chain of information and lineage into the information as it evolves. And he saw this not only for text, as illustrated here, but also for all other forms of media. He was, with his background, particularly interested in film and saw ways of creating, or envisioned at least, ways of creating film that was built in the same way. It was also a system that was built on ideas from his JOT text editor, where nothing was ever erased, so that a trail and a copy of every single version was kept forever and ever. So everything stored as a series of immutable versions identified by these unique Tumblr addresses, as they call them. And it wasn't just a backup system. It was a philosophy of memory. Ted Nelson being inspired by all the books he was surrounded with in his childhood, was also very inspired by Orwell's 1984. I hope most of you have read that book. It's an important book. And one of the ideas there is the concept of erasing history by just rewriting it, something that sadly happens in countries around the world today. And Nelson was very afraid of that happening. So he designed his Xanadu system for that never to be possible to do. So every change was referencing the previous version, and you would have infinite copies of everything that was ever produced living in this docuverse of systems. And it was not only about consumption, it was also about creation and also about contributing. So in every single piece of information that exists within the Xanadu hypertext system, everybody were allowed and encouraged to annotate the documents and information that they read, making like little notes in the margin or something like that. But this was a built-in concept. Underpinning this was also a system of micropayments, so that you had an incentive to actually contribute, because whenever someone used your information in a commercial setting, you would get a compensation for that. And that was built into the system itself. So recall, this was happening during the 1980s. That was when these ideas matured, and Nelson was building his Xanadu system. Something else happened at that time as well. In 1984, the Apple Macintosh arrived. And this is a milestone hailed as the fulfillment of the vision that we first had a glimpse on at Xerox PARC and in Engelbert's mother of all demos. The Mac had that graphical user interface. It had the mouse, it had the desktop, and it brought interactive computing to masses. Unsurprisingly, Ted Nelson was unimpressed. He said that the Macintosh represented a narrowing vision, not an expansion. And instead of reinventing literature, which was his grand project, it simply recreated the familiar, and the desktop metaphor made the screen behave like a desk piled with papers and folders. I think some of us can relate to a desktop fitting that description. And he also saw text processing as something that just mimicked typewriters, albeit it was easier to change the typeface that you were using. To Ted Nelson, again, this was people missing the point. Because computers were not about simulating paper. It was about transcending it. And he wanted this to be something different. So he kept on working on developing Xanadu, and towards the end of the 1980s, he actually got quite a good bit of funding for this. Autodesk became one of the big investors, and he had a large team working on this. One thing we need to know about Ted Nelson is that he was thinking like a businessman. Everything he has ever done has been conceptualized as a product that could be packaged and sold. And Xanadu was no different. He was envisioning Xanadu to be a product for the consumer and enterprise market. This is why he was thinking about these McDonald's-like roadside cafes where people could come and consume this, because that was, in his mind, a business that could make money. So with fragments of Ted Nelson's life, we come to the 1990s, where the idea of intertwinglement, which is a word that he also used, matures a lot. And it's always about his references from his childhood. This time, everything is about film. Because working on Xanadu, he came across a new concept that he trademarked called zigzag. It was a bold idea, and the way he describes this is like a film is a set of frames after each other, and you can use scissors to cut that up and rearrange the order of frames, recreating entirely different films from the same content. This got incorporated into his Xanadu idea as well. So in addition to all of the hypertext concepts with bidirectional links, the transclusion, the micropayments, and so forth, he envisioned something that was very different from what he saw at computers of the day. Think of something like a spreadsheet, which was one of the things that Ted Nelson thought was a very terrible idea. It was just the recreation of ledger, paper-based concept on screen. Instead, he envisioned zigzag as being a way to store information in a multidimensional space, where versions of everything could expand into ever-existing universes of information, and where you could navigate through that universe, seeing all versions of a text or a work of any sort of medial form alongside each other, and really explore and dive into the docuverse that was to become Xanadu. There was something different happening in the world outside of Ted Nelson's imaginary Xanadu palace as well. A different vision of global information began to take hold, and Tim Berners-Lee World Wide Web offered a simple system of documents linked together with these one-way hyperlinks. And it might have been crude compared to Ted Nelson's dreams and visions, but it was easy to implement and even easier to adopt. And the real breakthrough came in 1994, just a couple of years after the idea of the zigzag concept, with the release of Netscape Navigator. Suddenly, the web wasn't just a research project, it was in the hands of millions. And just with a click, you could browse from page to page, and the web exploded into the public's consciousness. This was a bitter moment for Ted Nelson. Xanadu had been in development for decades, but it was still unfinished. And he was still changing the complex design of Xanadu. And meanwhile, albeit it was far less ambitious, the web had captured the world. Well, at least there is something that Ted Nelson invented that is in there: the back button. Every time you click the back button, you click something that was invented and first described by Ted Nelson as a concept. Because his vision of navigating through things meant that you need to have mechanisms to move back and forth and sideways between things. So, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone in between, this is probably the most used thing in Ted Nelson's legacy, in addition to hypertext. And with the web taking hold, Xanadu becomes one of IT history's big what-if moments. What if? What if history, we could rewrite history, as Ted Nelson didn't want us to do. So let's go back to 1960, when Ted Nelson, the young Nelson, coins the term hypertext. This is the beginning of this story. A few years later, he gets the visions and for Xanadu as the product. But what if? What if Xanadu was not an idea for a product, but rather something that was common to do within the research world of IT to create specifications for something? What if he made something like the hypertext linking protocol? And coming into the 1970s, when he published Computer Lib, these ideas might have matured into requests for comments. It's already described in Computer Lib, and particularly the flip side, the Dream Machines part. Things like bidirectional links, transclusion notation, and document versioning. These are the things that matured in literary machines 10 years later. So these could already have been specifications, and it could have grown into something like a hypertext standards working group coming up with protocols for implementing this. That would change things a lot when we come to the 1990s, and Tim Berners-Lee sort of tying together the World Wide Webs using paper clips and string. Because instead of this one-way links and say simple HTML, we could actually have those things that Ted Nelson envisioned. We could have bidirectional links. And instead of Mosaic just being a web browser, it could have been a hypernet browser, implementing all of these things. That would probably change things a lot when we come into Y2K, where the World Wide Web starts becoming and changing the world a lot. We had things like content farms and rampant piracy at the turn of the millennium. This introduced loads of user-unfriendly technologies like digital rights management, which is something that very correctly Ted Nelson hates from the bottom of his heart. So let's just imagine that we had the concept that Nelson had introduced in the 1980s in his literary machines called transcopyright, which is the transclusion concept where you take one bit of information and reference it, and whenever that is reused and someone consumes that bit of information, there is a little micropayment going to the author of this. That would have leapfrogged the entire music piracy thing and gone directly into what we now know as streaming services, because all of that content would have been readily available and in a way that people probably would have been willing to pay for. A few dimes every time you listen to a song rather than having to buy the album itself. There are so many things. Think about things like social media coming a few years later, which is all about really commenting on things. You would have Nelson's concept of annotating whatever content is available online, and everyone could do that on everything, and it would be readable by everyone and visible to everyone. That would be what social media is. So, as he said, instead of having this great big open universe of information, humanity is trapped in systems of invisible walls. Walled gardens, anyone? With specific conventions created by hidden techies, the invisible people working behind the scene creating these systems. Sometimes that has happened a long time ago, and what has been done has never been questioned since. These are actually quite profound thoughts. It is that big what if. What if we could look into the crystal ball? One of the big challenges online today is the problem of disinformation. And it's an ever-growing problem. With Sanity and with hypertext, fact-checking would be an integral part of every single piece of information. And when someone would try to convince people to believe in some sort of conspiracy theory, you could very easily go back to the sources and see where this comes from, because everything is intertwingled. Intertwingled, that's another word that Nelson coined. So everything is connected to everything, and everything is visible to everyone. Think of something like a teenage aspiring musician sitting in his bedroom wanting to sample a few jazz greats, such as Miles Davis's British Brew. Instead of having to get a licensing agreement in place and permission to use that, what if that kid could just sample these two through transclusion and bring it in, remix it, and create something new? Every time his song is played, some money flows back and trickles down to the creators of the original work as well, creating a viable remix culture that could spark creativity in everyone. And what if all of these alien machines that go around the world gobbling up every single piece of information ever produced by any human around to create artificial intelligence and large language models which infringed immensely on other people's work, had done that through transclusion, then every single time you go on ChatGPT and have it write something for you, the poor soul who wrote the material that is based on gets paid. This would solve all of these problems that we see today. So Ted Nelson was a true visionary, and his ideas influence loads of things that are still part of our computer world and technological life today. And there are still people trying to build some of these things into their products. You will find products that are very much built on Ted Nelson's ideas. Sadly, no one has ever built the entire Xanadu hypertext system that he envisioned. And I'm bringing up this book. You will see the actual volume in a minute. Because Ted Nelson is 89 years old today. He's still working on building Xanadu. Because this has been his life's project. And he is a true visionary that has contributed immensely to all of the ideas that shape our society today. And he is giving very little credit for the work he has done.
It's been very lonely, but I've been absolutely sure of what I've been doing all the time. So one of the main definitions of paranoia is believing what nobody else believes. So one cure is for the patient to change his mind and believe what the rest of the world believes. That is the low road. The other, by which I hope to cure myself, is to persuade everybody else. And then I will no longer be paranoid, but recognized as having been right all along.
Thank you, Ted. And thank you for coming to this talk. I hope you had a great time. I hope you will have a great NDC Copenhagen party. Thank you all for coming. If anyone wants to talk about this, just find me at the party and we'll discuss this over a drink later. Thank you so much for coming.